Good afternoon, alumni, parents, colleagues, and friends. I'm Kasia Godleski, representing the Office of Alumni and Parent Engagement at Moyne College. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the kickoff of our special webinar series celebrating the 75th anniversary of Moyne's founding. We are excited to offer a webinar each month that will highlight a different aspect of the college. And what better way to begin with an informative, interesting, fun, and sure to be lively discussion on the college's early years. We are so excited to have two alumni lead this discussion. Mary Ann Munns Corsiniti, class of 1965, and John Langdon, class of 1967. While Mary Ann has firsthand experience of Moyne's early years, as her father served as a professor of mathematics from the day the college opened, and her family regularly entertained Moyne Jesuits as their dinner guests, Dr. Langdon has studied the college's history for years as he wrote Against the Sky, a book which celebrated the first 50 years of the college, and he is currently working on book 2 that will include the past 25 years. Professor Langdon has also been on the faculty at Moyne since 1971. So for the next 45 minutes or so, Mary Ann and John will share their own personal stories, as well as stories from the history books. From Bishop Forey's early plan for this little Catholic college to how Moyne has always been ahead of the times, I can assure you that we will all have a new sense of pride in our alma mater. We invite you to partake in this conversation by submitting questions or comments in the Q&A or the chat feature. At the end, Mary Ann and John will have a chance to respond to those, as well as those questions that were submitted earlier. From here, I'll turn this over to my friends, Mary Ann and John. Thank you both for being with us today. I'm looking forward to all you have to share.
Thank you, Kasia. And thanks to everyone who's tuned in to watch us today. John, if you're good with it, I think Kasia's remarks about Bishop Forey are probably a really good place to start this conversation. My history told me, or my dad told me growing up, my family, that Bishop Forey was really concerned about all these families that were sending their children to that college across town that was not based in Catholic theology, and wanted his diocesan folks to be married in the Catholic Church to Catholics. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I know that's what I was told. And I'd love to know what you know about that.
Mary Ann, thanks so much for working with me on this. And I just want to say hello and welcome to everybody who has signed on to this. And in particular, so many of my former students who, for one reason or another, have decided they want to say hello to me again. It's wonderful to have you all here. I just want to remind all of my former students, the exam will be next Tuesday at 10 o'clock, and please get your research papers in before that time, okay? Otherwise, there'll be big trouble. Mary Ann's question is really very interesting because there's so much that's been discussed and talked about regarding Bishop Forey's role in the foundation of the college. Bishop Walter Forey came from Rochester. He had been director of Catholic Charities in Rochester until he was appointed bishop in 1937. Rochester had a Catholic college, Nazareth College, that was founded in 1924. And when Bishop Forey got to Syracuse, he was disturbed. He knew already when he got here, but he was disturbed to essentially realize not only that there was no Catholic college in Syracuse, but that, as Mary Ann remarked, there was a college on the hill, Piety Hill, that was affiliated with the Methodist Church called Syracuse University. Bishop Forey was not anti-Protestant, but he associated with Protestants as little as possible. And he was afraid that they would all lose their immortal souls because they were simply following the wrong doctrine. And he didn't want Catholic young men and women to get involved in that kind of thing. And so he wanted, and this is very important in his thinking, Bishop Forey wanted a college that would be Catholic in nature, but that also would be coeducational. And in this, he was far ahead of his time. Most Catholic colleges and high schools in the 1930s were single sex. And Bishop Forey, who was A, socially progressive, and B, a notorious tightwad with money, had no intention of building two colleges in Syracuse. And he saw no reason why women and men couldn't go to classes together. And the rest, as we say, is history. And if, Marianne, if you want to talk more about that,
Yeah,
we
I
can.
do, John, because we got a really good question from John Clark of the class of 1967 about whether or not there were other orders that the bishop was looking at. But I also wonder if the Jesuits and Bishop Forey were a match made in heaven, or if that was a rocky road along the way.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it was made in heaven or in some other place, but it was an interesting match, to say the least. The bishop, in essence, I don't want to make it sound as crass as that he put out bids for what religious orders would like to do this, but it pretty much amounted to that. The Jesuits indicated their interest through the New York province of the Society of Jesus. And there was a female religious order, the Order of St. Ursula, the Ursuline nuns, who also indicated an interest in this. They had two colleges in the United States at the time, one of which was in New York State, the College of New Rochelle in downstate New York, which had opened in 1904 and was relatively well known in upstate New York. A good many women from upstate New York went to school there. So these were the two possibilities. In my research in which I dug into the diocesan archives to try to figure out why Bishop Forey selected the Jesuits over the Ursulines, I couldn't come to any exact, irrefutable conclusions. But the sense I got was that there were two reasons. One was that the Ursulines ran two colleges in the United States and the Jesuits ran 26. Their network was much more extensive. They had much more experience at this sort of thing. And that certainly was one thing that pops up in Bishop Forey's memoranda and remarks that are preserved in the archives. The second is just a hunch that I have from the way in which he communicated his wishes to other people, many of whom talked to me at one time or another over the past 30, 40 years. That is that he was more comfortable with a male religious order than he was a female religious order. There's no proof of that I could find. If there is proof, it's buried deeply within the archives of the diocese. So for whatever reason, he went with the Jesuits, which created a certain problem because the New York province of the Society of Jesus was willing to open a school here, but they would have to get clearance from their superior general in Rome in order to do so as a coeducational institution. They would have to get clearance from him anyway. The superior general at the time, Father Vladimir Ledakovsky, was a very staunch opponent of having women and men together in the same classroom. Notwithstanding this, the Jesuits went ahead and indicated to Bishop Forey that they would sign an agreement with him. And the agreement was scheduled to be signed on Tuesday in the Hotel Syracuse, the Persian Terrace of the Hotel Syracuse, Tuesday, December 9th, 1941. 2 days earlier than that, on December 7th, 1941, there was a certain unpleasantness that occurred in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, that started World War II, and that committed the structural steel of the United States to the military for as long as the war lasted. So there was not going to be any new college built right away, so Bishop Forey simply shelved the matter. He simply pushed the agreement off to one side of his desk and decided to wait. While everybody was waiting, Father Ledakovsky died in 1942. No one, of course, would say that was an act of God, but the result was the same. In 1945, when the war ended, Father Janssens of Belgium was appointed Superior General of the Jesuits, and it is rumored, scuttlebutt has it, and I could find no evidence for this either, but scuttlebutt has it that the Jesuits assured Father Janssens that although Moyne College would be co-ed, there wouldn't really be very many women in it. It would be more or less a token number of women who would actually appear. I can't find any evidence for or against that, but people keep talking about it, and so I mention it, but I certainly don't propound it as absolutely true. If that's what Father Janssens believed, he was very soon to be disabused of that notion.
For sure. John, it's wonderful to be able to talk to a historian who really knows so much about what happened. It was my understanding that the original site for Lemoyne was not going to be what we refer to now as the Heights. And if that's not the case, can you tell us what happened to move it to the Heights? And can you also tell us a little bit about where the first classes were taught? Because I
Sure.
know it wasn't the Heights.
Sure, yeah. Well, in 1943, Father Robert Gruen, for whom the administration building, Gruen Hall, is named, came to Syracuse and was charged by the province with finding a site for the college. By 1943, one thing was pretty clear in the United States. The war was not going to last forever. It was going to last maybe a couple or 3 years more, but after the Battle of Stalingrad in early 1943, it was pretty clear that Germany wasn't going to win the war. So the Jesuits went ahead. Father Gruen came to Syracuse. He stayed with Monsignor Edward Buttimer, who was the pastor of Our Lady of Solace Church, just down Salt Springs Road, for where Lemoyne was eventually located. Monsignor Buttimer drove him around. They found a property over on Sentinel Heights, which today is Brighton Towers facility, and that wasn't big enough. They looked at the Stacy Estate, which later became Christ the King Retreat House. That wasn't big enough for a college either. And eventually, there was a piece of property, a small piece of property on the north side, on the south side of Salt Springs Road. And that is the property on which St. Mary's Hall and Harrison Hall now stand. And Father Gruen and Monsignor Buttimer took a look at that. And as Father Gruen recalled many years later to me, I knew it was too small for a college, but I wasn't saying no to anything. So I decided to pursue it. And then he said, I looked across the road and saw a rather large farm. And I asked Monsignor Buttimer, who owns that farm? And he said, well, a lady named Rosamund Gifford, Miss Rosamund Gifford owns that farm. And Father Gruen asked, I wonder if she'd be interested in selling that. And Monsignor Buttimer said, well, you can contact her, but good luck, she's a recluse. She lives by herself on the north shore of Oneida Lake, and she does not really deal with people very much. Father Gruen, who was a diminutive, talkative, voluble, engaging, very bright fellow, said, give me your address and I'll go out and see her. So he drove out to the north shore of Oneida Lake, and the property had a gate on it. So he essentially rang the bell at the gate, and Miss Gifford came out to meet him carrying a shotgun. All of this should have dissuaded most reasonable people, but Father Gruen, trusting in God, continued to essentially approach Miss Gifford and talk to her about a variety of things, and she eventually let him come in. And they worked things out over that and a number of other visits. And the farm was eventually sold to the Jesuits of New York Province for approximately $50,000 for 103 acres. A relatively good deal, even understanding that, of course, $50,000 in 1943 was a good deal more money than it is today.
Yeah. But that isn't where the first class happened, right? We know that something took place on James Street, and it might be helpful to know why it happened that way, why we weren't ready to go in the Heights, and why James Street was the first site.
There's some interesting things about that whole process. Obviously, once the war ended, buildings would have to be built. The farm would have to be essentially changed from a farm into a campus for a college. This is something that doesn't necessarily happen overnight. And money would have to be raised for all of this. It was one thing for the bishop to say, let's have a college. It was one thing for the Jesuits to say, we're interested. All of this was going to cost money. In June of 1945, after the war in Europe ended, the Jesuit provincial of the New York province, Father James Sweeney, sent Father Andrew Buheis of Canisius College to Syracuse to start raising money for what would become Moyne College. And I have a quotation from his letter to Father Buhuis of June 20th that everybody may find interesting to hear. Dear Father Buhuis, you are being promoted, in quotes, to Syracuse, where you are to lay your plans for the collecting of a paltry $1 million for our new Syracuse College. Now, that would be approximately $9 million today. I have no clairvoyant powers, but I can give you the drift of your assignment. When I saw Bishop Forey in April, he said I could get a man into Syracuse to organize a drive for a new college as soon as possible. He gave me a personal check for $5,000 to start the good work and said that the Catholics of Syracuse had never really been touched up for money. With the bishop as chairman and a group of Father Gruen's retreatants to do the legwork, everything is made to order except the organization. That will be your job. It is a man-sized job, which requires the simplicity of Mother Cabrini and the brass of Al Capone. The bishop will be with you every step of the way, and he knows the score. I never met Father Sweeney, but after reading a couple dozen of his letters, I rather wish I had. He had a certain way of expressing himself that must have been very interesting to people who worked under him. At any rate, Father Buhuis came, worked with the bishop, starting the fund drive. The fund drive was held in January of 1946. It was a door-to-door, one-week campaign that raised over $600,000 in 1946 dollars, which is an awful lot of money for that day, when the average person working in a factory in Syracuse might bring home about $2,500 or $3,000 a year. It was possible for a variety of reasons to raise that much money. One was the commitment of Catholics in the Diocese of Syracuse to the idea of a Catholic college. The other was that during the war, there had been rationing, and people who worked as civilians had been required to buy war bonds, and those bonds essentially sat in many people's houses uncashed until the war ended. So there was some ready cash available. And the result was that eventually the money was raised and the construction of the new college began. It began under Father Anthony Blaker, who was the first president of Moyne College. He only lasted a year. His job was to begin the construction of Moyne College, and I think it would be fair and judicious to say he didn't do a very good job of it. Everything got delayed. Everything got pushed back. In the interim, the Society of Jesus acquired a number of properties in Syracuse, one of which was the Hiscock Mansion on James Street, not far from where Bishop Forey lived. A rather large mansion, something that really wasn't suited for a college. Father Ted Clarkson, who taught at Moyne for many, many years, talked to me once about this and said, I got off the bus in Syracuse and I went to this building and I looked at it and I said, is this a college? But basically you make do with what you have. It was right after the war and the first classes were held there. September 15th, 1947. Father Joe Beglin, who was the first academic dean at Moyne and who did all the scheduling of classes in the first year by hand with little index cards sprawled on the floor, moving them around to make sure no classes conflicted with anything else based on how many rooms he had in the house in order to work with. Put it all together, and as construction finally got started under Father Schlereth, the second president of Moyne, up at the farm, which would later become known as Moyne Heights, classes went on for that first year on James Street. At the end of that year, the buildings, the first building, the administration building, was ready to be dedicated on the Heights, and a procession of automobiles came up. There was a film of this in the college archives called Taking the Heights. A procession of automobiles came up from James Street to Moyne Heights, and essentially a large throng gathered to hear Father Schlereth essentially give an address and dedicate the college, and as he put it, to dedicate the buildings of the college to truth and peace. And from that point on, classes were able to be held at Lemoyne.
You know,
Where we know.
you just debunked one of the myths that I was taught when I was a kid.
What's
And that
that?
was that the class, that procession was a walk from James Street to Lemoyne, which I thought
Well,
would have
some
been
people,
all day.
yeah, well, some people did walk, and some people took the bus. But there was a whole procession. Everybody couldn't fit in the cars. Let's put it
Yeah.
that way. So it's not entirely untrue.
No.
It's not.
Okay,
It's not completely false.
good. For those of us who didn't grow up, and there's many who did not grow up in the Iroquois Nation or the Haudenosaunee area, and especially younger folks on this call, they may not know what Lemoyne is. Not by that I mean, why are we called Lemoyne College?
Oh, sure. The name. It took a while for the New York province to essentially decide on which name it would be. As you know, there are Jesuit colleges throughout the United States, and not all of them are named for former Jesuits. I mean, some are, but not. But there's Georgetown, there's Boston College. Some of them are simply given geographic names.
Right.
When Lemoyne was chartered, the name hadn't been decided on, and Lemoyne was Canisius College of Syracuse when it was first chartered, because that was the closest Jesuit school. Eventually, Father Simon Lemoyne, who had been a 17th century French Jesuit, and he's often characterized as a missionary to the Onondaga Nation and to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It wasn't entirely like that. Father Lemoyne's presence in the 1650s was requested by the Onondaga, who were the linchpin nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. They were the headquarters, in a sense, of the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee. They requested a negotiator, a diplomat. They sent to Quebec City for a diplomat from the French, who owned Canada at the time, who would help them negotiate some sort of working arrangement or peace treaty with the Mohawk Nation and with the Huron. And the result was Father Lemoyne was sent because he was a person who could easily pick up languages. Native American languages are very difficult to learn for people of European background, but Father Lemoyne learned the Onondaga language very readily, and he essentially presented himself as an honest broker, as someone who would be able to work with the Haudenosaunee to essentially work these things out with their neighbors. Obviously, from the Jesuit point of view, he was also a missionary. He was also someone who was going to bring the gospel, who was going to bring the word of God to people whom obviously most Europeans, most Christian Europeans would have considered heathens. Right? As far as the Haudenosaunee were concerned, of course, they were not heathens at all. They did not need the European God. They had God, the Great Spirit. They had always believed in God. And so if Father Lemoyne had come and presented himself solely as a missionary, he wouldn't have gotten very far at all. But his chief duty was as a diplomat, and he turned out to be a relatively good one. He traveled back and forth, worked on and off with the Haudenosaunee for about 12 years, until finally, in failing health, he went back to Canada. So basically, the Jesuit decision to name this college after Father Lemoyne was to root the new college in Syracuse with someone who had a past that was reflective of what was going on in Syracuse 300 years earlier. And not to name it after someone perhaps who was a saint of some former times who had no connection with Syracuse at all, which was a possibility, but they wanted someone whose name would resonate to some degree in Syracuse. There was already a Lemoyne Avenue in Syracuse. There was a Lemoyne Elementary School. There was a Lemoyne Park. So it was a name that most people in Syracuse had some familiarity with.
Great. I have another question I want to ask you, but before I do, I just want to comment that my grandson, who's in his junior year at Fairfield, wants you to know that Fairfield University is another Jesuit college that's named after the community, not just Georgetown.
Oh, good. Very, yes, well, University of San Francisco.
Yeah, well,
Right, Seattle
I'm
University.
standing up for my family
There are
here,
many.
John.
Also, by the way, one additional point, which Father Jim Finley, God rest his soul, who was interim president of Moyne for a time and was academic dean also, he and I had several conversations on this point. Moyne is not the first coeducational college that the Jesuits have operated.
Really?
It is the first college that was founded explicitly as a coeducational school. But other schools, such as St. Louis University, John Carroll University in Cleveland, and others, admitted women decades before Moyne was ever thought of, but they segregated them. They would only admit them, let's say, to the night school, or they would only admit them to a business program, or they wouldn't let them be residents on campus.
Yeah.
So nevertheless, those other schools were technically coeducational. We were the first founded to be a coeducational school explicitly.
Thank you. Well, as I read through the exciting history that you've written, there's some important names from my youth that jump out at me. Can you tell us, everyone that's listening today, a little bit more about people like Father Beglin, Father Schlurth, Father Fallon, Father Gruen, Father Fingerhut, Father Bush, Father Curry, Father Scott? These are people that I knew. And it's funny because when I ask you that, I also think, before you answer me, John, I think about people like my dad and who had a promising career as a professor at Syracuse University, and Leon Maltby and Charlie McCain and Rita McCain, and people in the early days of this college who really had opportunities to be anywhere. But I remember my mother telling me years ago that my dad, even though he could have stayed at Moyne, felt that this was just such an exciting place. So that it wasn't just the Jesuits that I've asked you about. There were a lot of people who made these choices. And I know there are people that are listening to us right now who could have gone to other places, who were in that class of 51, Kathy Elliott, Nancy Schutzo, Dan Brown, who they took a risk too. Everybody took a risk to go into this new endeavor called Moyne College. But I think these Jesuits that I've named made a huge difference in why Moyne is still here today.
Oh, I agree with you. I wish we could go over all of them. I'll just give a few sketches of a few of them. Father Bill Scott, who I was fortunate enough to have as a professor in 2 classes, was a professor of theology here for years and chair of the theology department. And I've been in the education business a long time, 50 years as a professor and as a student before that. I've never seen a teacher on any level who was the equal of Bill Scott in the classroom. He was absolutely spectacular. The college still has tape recordings of a number of his lectures in the archives. As Father Dan Mulhauser, our former chaplain for so many years, told me a couple of years ago, whenever the sheet was sent around for Jesuits to help out in various parishes with masses on the weekend or to do various work for the diocese voluntarily, Father Dan never approached Father Scott. He said, I knew better than to approach Father Scott. He was too busy making himself the best professor in the history of Moyne. And that was something that should be nurtured. And that's exactly what he did. Magnificent professor. Father Frank Fingerhut was assigned here. Many Jesuits, who came here, they were assigned to areas that were not in their area of expertise. Father Tom Ward, who taught history, he was assigned here as a history professor to teach Far Eastern history, East Asian history. He had been a Navy chaplain in the Pacific during World War II. That was the extent of his familiarity. with East Asian history, but he came here and did the job. They told him to do it and he did it. Father Fingerhut was a classicist. He was a Latin and Greek professor. He was assigned here as treasurer. He was not an accountant. Father Fingerhut, or Father Fingers, as many people affectionately or not so affectionately refer to him, was the treasurer here for 30 years and once spent 3 days searching for a penny in order to reconcile the college budget. There's something scriptural in that. If you remember the story of, the widow who swept her house looking for the drachma that she had lost, Father Fingerhut swept the entire college and he finally found it. There are so many people like that. Father John Bush came here from Fordham and essentially worked with Dr. Charles Pikert, one of the lay people whom you mentioned, who dedicated his life to this school and professionalized the history department between Father Bush and Father Pikert working together, and Dr. Pikert working together to recruit professional people. There are so many. Father Curry, who is responsible for the alma mater. He wrote the alma mater in 1950 and taught English here for many years and was an exceptional professor. There are so many, and it would take us an entire hour to discuss many of them. One thing that you bring up that is very important: many people dedicated their professional lives to this school, working for very little money, working for very few fringe benefits, but working toward a goal, working toward a purpose. It's important to have a purpose in life.
Right.
And the people who came to Lemoyne, many of them, they considered this a calling. They considered this a vocation, not just to teach, but to teach in a Catholic college like Lemoyne. It is also interesting to note that, and I know Nancy Schutzow is on today, she's one of, and a number of people from the class of 51, that first graduating class, there were a number of people who could have gone to other colleges, but who waited until Lemoyne opened in 1947. A number of veterans on the GI Bill who could have started college in the fall of 1945 at a state school or somewhere else. They postponed. The war had already postponed their careers. They postponed their careers further in order to go to Lemoyne College when it was just a gleam in Bishop Forey's eye. That takes faith.
It does.
That takes an enormous amount of faith, and it also takes nerve. And that combination of faith and nerve built this college.
It's interesting you say that we could speak about each one of these people for an hour, because people watching us don't know that we probably have enough questions to go on for 3 days. And I'm trying to juggle here how we look at the beginnings of the college. But everybody should know that John's written a book. It's going to be coming out, and you should be looking for it because it gives you a vast amount of information about some really good history of Lemoyne. John, talk to us a little bit about our academic startup, because it was mostly oriented, I think, toward industrial relations, partially because I think Bishop Forey was interested in that. Is that true?
Well, it's partially true. Bishop Forey was very interested in what he called a labor school. Bishop Forey was a fascinating man. We could do a whole program on him. He was doctrinally very, very traditional within Catholicism, but socially, he was very progressive. Not only in terms of bringing in women to study together with men, but he was very progressive in the labor management field. You have to remember, 1945, 1946, the Great Depression had not been that long ago, and it had emotionally scarred most Americans. The idea that the war would end and we would go back to mass unemployment was very present in most people's minds. Forey was afraid that would happen. Now, we know that didn't happen, but no one knew it at the time. Forey believed there would be strikes, there would be labor stoppages, there would be unrest, and he was very much imbued with Catholic social teaching, with the idea that labor and management have not only rights, but they have duties and obligations to each other and to society. Dating back to Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, and all those encyclicals from that time on. So he wanted a labor school that would essentially propound Catholic social teaching and work with people in both labor and management in the business community of Syracuse to try to ensure labor peace. The Jesuits, that wasn't something that many Jesuits had studied, industrial relations. I mean, that was, Jesuit education was liberal arts and sciences, right? Your father taught mathematics, right? The natural sciences, philosophy, theology, English, history, modern languages. That's what Jesuit education, that was Jesuit education's wheelhouse. Industrial relations, okay. It would be a good work if the bishop wanted it. Let's try and do it. The problem was finding somebody. It was not easy. Richard McKeon, another of the founding Jesuits of the college, who just was able not only to build and organize an industrial relations major, that was one thing, but also to write letters to the editor, to the Syracuse newspapers, to speak at parish halls, to speak at organizations like the Corinthian Club, to essentially become a public intellectual who didn't just teach courses at Moyne, but who went out into Onondaga County and spread the Catholic social gospel. That's what the labor relations school, the labor relations approach needed. It was by no means certain that they could find somebody like that. They were very, very fortunate that Father McKeon was able to do that. And again, this was not something which was essentially what he thought of doing. But we have to remember that the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, emphasizes portability. People, men who go where they are needed, who go where there is a calling, who go where there is a need. And that self-sacrifice, that willingness to say, I don't really have the training to do what they're asking me to do, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. And with the grace of God, it's going to work out. That's an amazing energy. And I think years ago, I was talking with Professor Rob Flower about this. Many people who are former students of Moyne will remember Rob Flower, a brilliant philosophy teacher, absolutely magnificent, a legendary figure at the college. And he told me once, he said, you know, John, Moyne is essentially a vast reservoir of spiritual energy translated into an institution of higher learning. And I looked at him and I said, that is one of the best definitions of Moyne College I've ever heard of. And it speaks to exactly what you and I have just been talking about.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I've been trying to kind of watch the questions that are and comments that are coming in. Not doing it well, I will admit, but people are mentioning, you know, different professors that they had and people on campus, you know, Jen Saya, Peg Schneider, Peg Dwyer, all Barb Carper, all these amazing women that have been there. And John and I talking about this today, but Kasha has assured us that not only were these women, the women I just named, mentioned in the recent, I call it the replacement of the Founders Day. I apologize, Kasha, because I don't know the right language, but the recently promoted video Zoom meeting where we honored those women. But all of us have these memories. And it's funny because growing up on the campus as I did, I always thought that I had a very unique and special experience of family at Moyne that other students didn't have. I was asked once to speak at a Women of Moyne event, and the person who spoke before me, Kate Flannery, spoke of Moyne as if she had lived my life. She loved Moyne and felt that Moyne loved her. And I thought my unique experience was not unique after all, that there's this special thing that happens at Moyne. And I know as a child, my father worked with other staff and faculty to plant trees on the road, which now goes up to Gruen Hall. Those great big trees were little tiny trees. When I was a kid, they were planted by the people, the students, the faculty, the staff. And it was such a tightly knit family. And it wasn't just Mary Ann that experienced it. It seems as if all of us over the years have experienced it in a very similar way. And I'm wondering if it's still here, and if not the same, how is it different, and what keeps us together as Moyne?
Oh, that's a great line of questioning. Basically, what you say is absolutely true. For the classes, the first classes, the 1950s, the early 60s, when I was here as a student, the people I went to school with, 64, 65, 66, 67, so many thought of Moyne as a special place, an unusual place, not just a college, not just a place to get an education, but a really special, personalized, important place in their lives. We all knew students, friends of ours from high school who went to other colleges. They didn't talk about their colleges the way we talked about Moyne. I'm still teaching here. I want to let everybody know, right? Moyne has changed through the years. Maybe we can talk about some of those changes if we have the time. Moyne, Heraclitus told us in our freshman philosophy course, you can't step into the same river twice. And that was true. And that still is true. This is not the Moyne of the 50s or the Moyne of the 60s. But one thing has persisted, and I know this from talking to so many of my own students from succeeding classes and to students whom I teach now. It's still special. It's not special to them in the same way it was special to Mary Ann or to me or to others like us. It's special in a different way, but it's still unusual. It's still special. There's still something about it. And so many people say that. So many young students, middle-aged, graduates of college, older people like me, they remember it and it's still vivid. What explains it? I wish I knew. If I could bottle it, I could sell it to other colleges and universities and make myself a fortune. I can't bottle it, right? I can say, however, that, and this is one thing that I think is important, that people whom I talk to sometimes at reunions and things of that nature, alumni gatherings, ask me, what about the curriculum? When I was here, I'm speaking for me, I took 24 hours of philosophy. I took 15 hours of theology. People who were here in the 50s took more philosophy and theology than that, right? And very often I'm asked, why is there less philosophy now? Why is there less theology? Because those things were so important. And they were. They were important. Some of us at the time didn't exactly enjoy them to the degree that we enjoy looking back on them. But they were very important in building our character and building the kind of people we became. And the answer I always give is, if you take a look at a Moyne catalog from the 60s, let's say, and you count the number of majors that were offered, number of major fields, and you take a look at the Moyne College catalog today, I can list you 17 major fields at Moyne that had not been invented when I was a student at Moyne. They were not. Cybersecurity. Who in the class of 1967 ever heard of cybersecurity when we were going to school? Physician assistant. Are you kidding me? A physician assistant was my mother. She was a registered nurse who used to bring the doctor coffee and used to draw up the shots and that kind of thing and clean up the examining room after he had finished. That was a physician assistant. Times have changed. And the important thing is that Jesuit education has always been present-minded and forward-looking. Not just in the United States, but in Europe, everywhere. Jesuit education prepares young men and women not to live in the Middle Ages, but to live today and into the future. And that's the kind of approach that Moyne has always cherished. Moyne had the labor relations school when so few other people did, other colleges did. Moyne had a major in business administration, a major in accounting, at a time when many Jesuit colleges avoided that sort of thing. It's that forward-looking and present-mindedness that says if we're going to send out young men and women into a very, very complex world, they have to be prepared in a number of fields, in a number of ways, not just the fields I was prepared in, or that you were prepared in, Marianne, when we were students here.
But I do want to say, John, there were many of us in the 50s and 60s who, if we had been in another school being forced to take 20 some hours of philosophy, would have at a minimum had a minor. We couldn't get a major or a minor out of our 24 hours. John and I could probably go on forever, but I see a familiar face back on the screen with us. So we're going to try and take some time. Let me wrap up though, if you would, Kasha, just by saying we've only begun to touch the tip of the iceberg. Kasha's got some great stuff coming up in the next few months. And I hope all of you will join in and learn more about this gem that we love so much. And John, I'm honored that I was able to spend this hour with you. And thank you, Kasha, for asking.
Oh, thanks to both of you. I have to admit, I'm a bit overwhelmed from your incredible conversation to reading the chat and the questions coming in. It's really beautiful. I feel like I'm at just a big party and I'm kind of a fly on the wall reading these conversations. I see two of our alums recognize that they're both out in Portland, Oregon. They've exchanged phone numbers. It's amazing. It's really, really fun. So thanks, everybody. We do have a couple of questions. We're about 10 minutes to the hour here. And I've got a couple announcements at the end. It's kind of like going to church, right? There's always a couple announcements at the end, but lots of questions. And so I'm just going to pick a few of them. And then if there are additional ones, we can follow up. But one question was, John, do you remember how many women were in that first class? And then someone's interested in too, what the current breakdown of men versus women is.
I don't have any numbers on the first class. I know the first class was large. It was much larger than subsequent first classes because of all the students who had deferred going to other colleges early, who could have gone in 45 or 46, would have waited till 47. So the first class was over 400 students. We didn't get up to taking in 400 students again until the 1970s. Mm-hmm. So it was a big cohort that came in at first. How many of those were women? A relatively small percentage, because remember, in those days, in 47, there were no dormitories at Moyne. The first dormitory was Nelligan Hall, right, opened in 1954. St. Mary's Hall for women didn't open until 1962. So essentially, in order to go to Moyne, you had to be a commuter in the early years. And then once out-of-town men started to come in, out-of-town women couldn't come in unless they could find rooms in houses, in private homes that were near Moyne, that were within bus line distance or walking distance from Moyne. So my guess is that in the first class, first of all, the number of women, the percentage of women was probably not more than 10 or 15%, I wouldn't think. And then the first class, of course, changed radically. So many who started in 47 could not finish their degree in 1951 because the Korean War intervened and they were remobilized into the armed forces and had to go and fight in Korea. And so then they came back to Moyne later on. So that was, it was a very choppy beginning in a sense for the college enrollment-wise. Today, our percentage of female students generally ranges between 58 and 61% of the college. It's a complete, again, another way in which it's a completely different world. The emphasis that not only Moyne, but so many other institutions of higher education in this country have placed on the importance of educating women is one of the most enormous changes that I've seen during my time in higher education. It's a wonderful change. It was long overdue. But when it came, Moyne has been a leader in it, as we have been a leader in so many other things. Thanks
for that, John. And actually, that brings up two other questions. One, I want to talk a little bit about maybe the GI Bill and kind of the military and the wars that played a role in the college's history. But to back up, when you talk about, women and building the dormitories, this idea of women not being allowed to live on campus. And so St. Mary's was built across the street. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh, yeah. That's a myth. All right. I mean, St. Mary's was built across the street, absolutely. But that area across the street, which Father Gruen saw and said, I wasn't saying no to anything, he bought that along with the farm. That was always intended to be part of Lemoyne's campus. The fact that there was a road running through it, well, there are roads that run through Georgetown's campus. There are plenty of roads that run through Boston College's campus. So the myth grew up that women were sort of shoved off someplace else. I don't know why the women's dorm was built there and the men's second dorm, Dablon Hall, was built on campus. Maybe they didn't want the women's dorm built where Dablon Hall is today because it would be in too close proximity to Elgin Hall. I mean, I don't really know that. People who've been here longer than I would have to answer to that. But there was never the idea that putting women there was somehow putting them off campus. That was on campus. I will say, however, that they should have been placed much closer, or at least a pedestrian bridge should have been built across that street, because I have graphic memories of walking my girlfriend, who became my wife, back to St. Mary's Hall in god-awful Syracuse winter weather, and boy, do I wish that the dorms had been closer. But
right. Well, and John, I just want to add that so many women tell the stories of the dress code and how they had to wear skirts or dresses. And so they either had to walk up the hill from the parking lot or walk up the hill from St. Mary's. So I agree that residence hall should have been closer. So, but going back to that second question, is that someone asked about the GI Bill and how was that a part of the college's history, and did it help us get off the ground at that time? And you mentioned the Korean War, and I know a number of our students started at Lemoyne, had to leave, to fight for our country and then come back. So could you comment on that a little bit?
Sure. Lemoyne was never intended to be a GI school. I mean, Lemoyne was intended to be a Catholic school. And of course, when the agreement was about to be signed, the war hadn't even started yet. No, for that matter, no one knew until 1945 that Congress was going to do what it did. The GI Bill is one of the most influential pieces of legislation ever passed in the United States by any Congress. It created a tremendous educated class from people who never could have afforded to go to any college, state or private, on their own. But that was unanticipated. The Jesuits never counted on that. It affected so many people. Marianne mentioned Father Fallon earlier, Frank Fallon. When he was dean at Lemoyne in the mid-50s, he would work tirelessly with young men coming back from the Korean War, who were trying to reintegrate themselves into civilian life, into an educational experience. We have things like that today with Veterans House and our various outreaches to veterans. Many of our alumni and friends, I hope, know that Lemoyne is one of the most veteran-friendly colleges in the United States. But way before any of that was even thought of, Father Fallon would work endlessly with people who had problems. We would call it today post-traumatic stress disorder, all kinds of difficulties. He shepherded these people through. And many of them went on to become very, very successful in later life, largely because Lemoyne cared about them, because he cared about them. Right? Those things are very, very important. The connection between Lemoyne and military service and military veterans, we've never had an ROTC program at Lemoyne. Lemoyne is not a militaristic establishment by any stretch of the imagination. But the way in which Lemoyne has always supported military veterans is something I think the college can be very proud of, and which dates back to the earliest days of the college.
This is such a fascinating, we could just go on. I'm sitting here thinking about not a militant college, and I'm thinking about being there in the 60s when Father Berrigan was helping guys burn their draft cards. We may have been militant in a different way, but we are unique, and we never even touched on that, John.
Yeah, there's so much more.
The first person ever to burn his draft card in the United States, David Miller, Moyne, class of '65.
Yeah. Right there, and there's so much more to talk about here. But what you did mention there was the care of the person, and it's one of the first things that I learned at Moyne was the care of the whole person. And I think in talking about how special Moyne is, that's really what it's all about. And Marianne, as we had talked earlier about that question, is Moyne still the same, still kind of that family friendly? And I shared with John and Marianne that my kids, I have 3 children that have grown up on that campus, that have driven a golf cart around that campus, have been on scavenger hunts through Gruen Hall as I'm working in my office. So I think it still is that place, and it is really special. But we are at 12:59, so we're hitting the hour here. I just again have a couple of last announcements. Again, thank you all so much for joining us, and for John and Marianne. It was just really such a fun way to spend our hour. Like I said, a couple of reminders. On January 27th, our Insights from the Heights webinar series will feature 2 more alums, Marianne Green Cody, class of 1984, and Kate Cogswell, class of 1985. Both Marianne and Kate are attorneys, and they'll share their expertise on estate planning and how to care for your family and achieve your charitable goals. So please watch your email inbox and our website for that information. And then next month, we'll offer the second webinar in our series celebrating Moyne's 75th anniversary. On February 10th, which is during Black History Month, we'll host a webinar titled Growth and Change, an Historical Perspective of Diversity at Moyne. And in March, as part of Women's History Month, we'll look to celebrate the female leaders who were and are currently a part of the Moyne community. And some of those names were mentioned. So stay tuned, as there'll be more information there. Before we sign off, I just want to take this opportunity to mention our annual Giving Day, which will be Thursday, February 18th. It's all about participation on this day. We're hopeful to receive 1,750 gifts in honor of our 75th anniversary. So save the date. Please plan to participate. Encourage your friends to invest in the college that has provided us with so much. So on behalf of Moyne College and the Office of Alumni and Parent Engagement, I'd like to extend our gratitude once again to our presenters, Marianne and John, and thank all of you for being with us today. It was really a great hour. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. Thanks, Kasha. Thanks to everyone who attended.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
You too.